Over the weekend, Donald Trump stepped up his trade war with the world by threatening 30% tariffs on Mexico and on the European Union. That announcement, with its August 1st deadline, was met with an angry response from EU negotiators who thought a trade agreement was well on track. Well, EU trade ministers met today to work out a response to a threat they described as absolutely unacceptable. So far, Brussels has held back on counter-tariffs, but the bloc is now getting ready to retaliate if talks with Washington fail.
Brussels is still pursuing an amicable agreement after Washington threatened a 30% tariff on EU exports to the US.
We are committed to continuing working with the US on a negotiated outcome. It has to be a mutually beneficial agreement on terms that are acceptable to both sides. At the same time, we are prepared for all possible scenarios. If no satisfactory solutions can be found, the EU remains ready to react, and that includes robust and proportionate countermeasures if required.
Brussels says it's putting forward a new list of goods worth 72 billion euros that could be targeted by EU levies if the tariff talks with Washington fail. A list of goods worth 21 billion euros has already been approved and is on hold. Donald Trump's letter threatening to impose a 30% tariff on the bloc came as a shock surprise to EU trade ministers who thought a deal was about to be sealed.
We noted with regret and disappointment the letter sent by the United States President to the European Union, especially considering the advanced stage of our ongoing negotiations. The feeling on our side was that we are very close to an agreement. I mean, we have been negotiating this agreement in principles for weeks.
There is still confusion over whether the 30% tariff threat is just a negotiation tactic.
It's hard to say these days because it's coming new news every single hour and every single week from the White House. But of course 30% is nothing that Sweden or the European Union should accept. I think we should have to be prepared to be even tougher negotiators against the US right now.
In a gesture of goodwill, the EU has again delayed any retaliation. Europe is trying to avoid a trade war with the US, but the negotiations are dragging on, causing uncertainty for the businesses that produce the 4.6 billion euros of goods and services traded across the Atlantic every day.
Now, Alan Auerbach is a professor of economics and law at Berkeley Economics at the University of California. Welcome to DW. The EU...
Thank you very much.
They thought they were close to a deal, and then President Trump announces this latest 30% tariff threat. So is a trade agreement before August the 1st still a realistic prospect?
That's a very good question. My own personal guess is there'll be further delays and further innovations in tariff policy. There have been, since the beginning of April, when President Trump announced his initial tariffs, we've had several changes in policy, several new tariffs announced, several postponements of tariffs going into effect, and very few actual agreements reached. I think this process is likely to continue. It's unfortunate for the world economy and for international trade, but I'm afraid that's the situation we're in.
And do you believe that there is strategy behind this, or is this as chaotic as it looks? Because if you take the US-EU example, those talks were still going on, and suddenly this 30% just pops out of thin air. What's going on?
Well, that's a good question. And unfortunately, the president has not been very transparent with the American public, not to mention all of our foreign trading partners about what the strategy is. There have been some, cases where changes in policy have been induced by U.S. threats. For example, Canada agreed to withdraw its digital service taxes, which was going to go into effect and have an impact on U.S. producers. So there are, a few cases of things like that happening where it appears that the U.S. has accomplished something with its threats. But in many more cases, it's very, very hard to tell what the motivation is, and it's hard to see that anything much has been accomplished.
So how important then is the US-EU trade relationship for the global economy?
It's very important. It's very important for the U.S. and it's very important for the EU. The U.S. economy has somehow managed to be quite resilient in the last couple of years, including the beginning of this year when there have been predictions of catastrophe as a result of the policies being adopted. But as you know, Europe's economic picture is not as strong, and therefore any disruptions to trade between the U.S. and the EU, which would hurt both the U.S. and the EU, would perhaps have more significant effects on Europe simply because of the position in which you start.
So if you were in a position to whisper in the EU Trade Commissioner's ear, what would be your advice? What is the best strategy? Do they go toe-to-toe with Donald Trump, or do they give him something?
I would say be patient, try a variety of strategies to see what might work, and don't believe the latest threats as being the final policy decision of the United States. That there have been, over the course of the last few months, there have been a head-spinning number of updates in U.S. tariff policy. It is certainly true that the U.S. now has higher tariffs than it's had since the 1930s, even the ones that are in place already, not the ones that are being threatened. One of the things that might have given pause to the U.S. policy would have been, negative signals on the U.S. economy, spikes in inflation, sharp increases in unemployment, or other things like that have been forecast. They haven't really happened yet. And I think that as long as the U.S. economy continues to roll along without major indications of problems coming from the tariff policy, this will embolden President Trump to continue doing what he's doing.
Right. The point on the economy is interesting because you wrote recently, you said recently that Trump's tariffs would ultimately weaken the U.S. economy. So did you get that wrong, or is that still to come?
I think the jury is still out on that. I think we have had some time. I think I expected, and I think many people expected, the negative effects to show up sooner. I still believe they're going to show up. I think by the end of the year, we're going to see a weaker economy and higher prices than we otherwise would have. But I'm always willing to update my estimates based on what I observe. And so far, the outcomes have been better than I expected.
How much extra revenue has this random tariff policy actually generated for the United States? Is it helping to bring down the deficit?
It is certainly significant. I haven't seen estimates of what we've collected so far, but I have seen estimates of what we would collect under current policy. That is, if not the policies that have been threatened, for example, with respect to the EU for August 1st, but if we simply look at policies that are in effect today, over the next 10 years, we could raise a couple of $1 trillion from the tariffs that are in place. That's a significant amount of money. It's less. It's about half as much as we just spent through tax cuts and spending increases through the large domestic policy bill that Congress just passed and President Trump signed earlier this month. So even with that revenue, we're still behind where we were at the beginning of the Trump administration in terms of the deficits over the next several years. But the tariffs will have a significant impact on revenue. The bigger question, though, is at what economic cost this revenue comes. We always think about tax increases as having positive effects in terms of revenue and potentially negative effects in terms of economic performance. And we also tend to think of tariffs as being worse than other kinds of taxes in terms of the trade-off between revenue and economic performance. So the revenue that the tariffs may raise is really only one part of the story. And we'll have to see over the next several months to what extent these tariffs are causing the damage that many of us still expect to happen.
Well, perhaps we'll have another conversation in a couple of months. For now, though, Professor Alan Auerbach from the University of California, thank you so much.
And thank you.